the first thing that makes Sunghear feel almost impossible is not simply its age, although 34,000 years reaches deep into the Ice Age, into a world of mammoths, reindeer, frozen rivers, and human groups moving across enormous distances with tools, ornaments, memory, and myth. The deeper mystery is that Sunghear feels too elaborate for the simple story we often tell about early people in Europe. Beneath the soil east of Moscow, archaeologists uncovered burials so rich, so carefully arranged, and so filled with effort that they seem to belong to a society already fluent in ceremony, inheritance, identity, and ritual. An adult man lay covered with thousands of mammoth ivory beads, pierced fox teeth, bracelets, and red ochre, while two children were placed head to head in one of the most extraordinary graves ever found from the deep Ice Age, surrounded by ivory spears longer than their bodies and ornaments that required huge amounts of labor. This was not survival alone. This was memory turned into craft. This was a community spending precious time on the dead, shaping bone and ivory into symbols and building a burial scene that still speaks across 34,000 years. Sunghear matters because it sits at a strange crossing point in the human story. Geographically, it lies far to the east of the famous caves of France and Spain, far from the classic Western European image of Cro-Magnon hunters painting animals on cave walls, carving figurines, and building the cultural world of the Upper Paleolithic. Yet genetically and culturally, Sunghear is not cut off from that Western world. It belongs to the same broad expansion of early modern humans across Ice Age Europe, the same deep network that connects Russia, Central Europe, Western Europe, and later Siberia. The people at Sunghear were not isolated Eastern outsiders. They were part of a vast human web stretching across the Mammoth Steppe, a cold ecological highway that connected Atlantic Europe with the plains of Russia and the interior of Asia, and that is where the story begins to turn from burial archaeology into something larger, because the same northern world that held Sunghear also points toward one of the strangest facts in human ancestry. Some of the genetic ancestry that later appears in Native Americans has roots in this old Ice Age world of northern Eurasia. At first glance, that sounds almost absurd. A burial site near Moscow, covered in ivory beads and mammoth symbols, connected in any way to people who eventually became the ancestors of indigenous peoples of the Americas. Yet the genetic story forces exactly that kind of larger map. Sunghear itself is not the direct ancestor of Native Americans in a simple father-to-son line. That would be too crude, too easy, and incorrect. Instead, Sunghear belongs to an earlier western branch of a broader Upper Paleolithic Eurasian world. Later, farther east, another branch of that broad northern ancestry appears in Siberia, most famously represented by the Malta child near Lake Baikal, and that branch contributed ancestry to the founding peoples of the Americas. The connection is not a straight line from Sunghear to the New World. It is a family resemblance across deep time, a sign that the northern half of Eurasia held ancient human lineages that later split, shifted, mixed, and resurfaced in places that seem, from geography alone, almost unbelievable. The Western European connection is easier to see at first because Sunghear fits into the world of early European modern humans. These were tall, mobile, cold-adapted people with long limbs, powerful bodies, and symbolic cultures already capable of creating ornamented graves, carved ivory, personal decoration, and group identities. Sunghear shares that broad cultural universe with sites farther west, including the Gravettian world of Central and Western Europe, where mammoth ivory, elaborate burials, personal ornaments, and carved figures appear across wide distances. The adult male at Sunghear, covered with roughly 3,000 ivory beads, immediately recalls a wider Upper Paleolithic habit of dressing the body in symbolic material, turning clothing, hair, belts, caps, and grave coverings into statements of belonging. These beads were not casual decoration. Each one had to be shaped, drilled, polished, and arranged. A single bead is a small thing. Thousands of beads are a declaration of labor. The children make the mystery sharper. They were not simply buried. They were staged with extraordinary care. Their bodies were placed head to head, surrounded by thousands of ornaments, animal remains, and long mammoth ivory spears that had to be straightened from curved tusk material through skilled work. These spears were not ordinary items dropped into a grave without thought. They represent planning, technical command, and symbolic excess. Children of around 10 and 12 were given a burial that rivals the adult male, which means the community was not only honoring age or hunting success. Something else was at work. Status at Sunghir was not merely earned through a lifetime of action, it was also inherited, assigned, ritualized, or attached to identity in a way that reaches beyond simple explanations. The dead children were made into symbols by the living. That detail matters for the Western European comparison, because Upper Paleolithic Europe was not a flat world of small bands with identical habits. It was a mosaic of communities sharing broad traditions while also creating local expressions of meaning. In Western Europe, burials such as those associated with early Cro-Magnon groups show ornamentation, ochre, and careful treatment of the dead, yet Sunghir pushes the scale to an almost theatrical level. It tells us that the same early European world capable of cave art and portable figurines was also capable of deeply structured mortuary display far to the east. The distance between France and Russia was not an empty cultural gulf. It was part of a connected Ice Age arena where people moved, exchanged mates, transmitted ideas, and carried symbolic traditions across enormous spaces. The genetic evidence strengthens this picture. Sunghir individuals belong to the early Western Eurasian side of the Upper Paleolithic human story, connected to ancient Europeans such as Kostenki, and to later groups associated with the Gravettian horizon. They are not a perfect match for modern Europeans, because 34,000 years is far too deep for that. Modern Europeans were shaped by later waves, including hunter-gatherers after the Ice Age, early farmers from Anatolia, steppe pastoralists, and many regional transformations. But Sunghir sits beneath that later complexity as one of the older foundations of European ancestry. It gives us a glimpse of a Europe before the later reshuffling, before farming, before steppe ancestry, before the genetic map became familiar. In that sense, Sunghir is not the direct face of Europe today, but one of the deep ancestral chambers beneath it. The same genetic data also unsettles a simple family-based reading of the burials. The people buried at Sunghir were not all near relatives in the way one might assume from their shared graves and shared ritual treatment. That means the society around Sunghir had relationships that were not reducible to immediate biological family. They were building bonds through group membership, exchange, ritual, and perhaps alliance across neighboring bands. This fits the broader genetic picture. They were not trapped in tiny inbred bands. They were part of a wider breeding network, maintaining genetic diversity through social connections across distance. In Ice Age terms, that is a powerful finding. It means that even in cold northern environments, human communities were not simply scattered and disconnected. They were linked across the landscape, probably through seasonal movement, marriage exchange, shared meeting grounds, and social rules that kept groups open enough to survive. That broad network is the key to the Native American connection. To understand it, Sunghir has to be placed inside a northern Eurasian world that stretched beyond Europe into Siberia. During the Upper Paleolithic, Northern Eurasia was not divided into the modern continents and identities we imagine today. It was a continuous belt of steppe, tundra, river valleys, and cold open habitats. Mammoths, horses, reindeer, wolves, and humans moved across it. The people who lived there were not one tribe, one language, or one culture, but they were linked by ancestry at different depths. Sunghir represents one Western expression of that world. Malta, much farther east and several thousand years later, represents another. And Malta revealed something that shocked researchers when it was first understood. An Upper Paleolithic Siberian child carried ancestry related not only to Western Eurasians, but also to the ancestry that later entered Native Americans. This is where the story becomes genuinely strange. Native American ancestry is often explained as deriving from ancient peoples connected to Northeast Asia, and that is true in a major sense, but it is incomplete. The founding ancestry of Native Americans also contains a deep Northern Eurasian component, linked to ancient Siberians related to Malta and the wider ancient North Eurasian world. That means the first peoples of the Americas were not descended from a single simple East Asian source. They formed from a mixture involving Northeast Asian ancestry and a Northern Eurasian lineage with distant ties to the same broad world that also included early Europeans. Sunghir, sitting farther west and earlier in time, is not the source of that ancestry, but it demonstrates the existence of an older, widespread Northern Eurasian human layer before the later American story even begins. The mystery is not that Sunghir people sailed to America or marched across Beringia themselves. They did not. The mystery is that the Ice Age map was far more connected than the modern map suggests. A person looking at Europe, Siberia, and the Americas today sees distinct regions separated by language, culture, and history. But ancient genetics reveals older bridges beneath those divisions. The Northern Eurasian world gave rise to branches that moved in different directions. Some contributed to later Europeans. Some contributed to ancient Siberians. Some mixed into the ancestors of Native Americans. Across tens of thousands of years, the descendants of related Ice Age networks ended up on opposite sides of the planet. This reshapes how we think about Western Europe as well. The classic image of Cro-Magnon Western Europe often stands alone, as though France and Spain were the central theatre of early modern human creativity, while Eastern Europe and Siberia were peripheral. Sunghir turns that picture inside out. It shows that the Eastern Plains held societies as symbolically intense as anything in the West. The beadwork, the ivory spears, the ochre, and the elaborate child burial all show a community capable of high-investment ritual behavior at the same time that early modern human culture was unfolding across Western Europe. The Western caves were not the whole story. The center of gravity was wider, colder, and more Eurasian than the familiar cave art narrative implies. The Y chromosome story deepens the sense of disappearance. The Sunghir males carried ancient paternal lineages that were once part of early Upper Paleolithic Eurasia, but are extremely rare or mostly absent today. This tells us that the human landscape of Ice Age Europe was later transformed. Whole male lineages that once stretched across Europe and Western Asia were reduced, replaced, or absorbed by later demographic changes. The people of Sunghir contributed to the deep ancestry of later Western Eurasians in a broad sense, but their exact lines did not simply continue unchanged into the modern world. They were part of a vanished layer, preserved in bones and genomes rather than in a clean living lineage. That pattern appears again and again in ancient genetics. Early Upper Paleolithic Europe was not the final ancestor of Europe in a simple way. It was an early chapter followed by losses, refuges, expansions, bottlenecks, and later mixture. The Gravettian world rose. The last glacial maximum shattered habitats. Western European refugees endured, Eastern groups shifted, the Magdalenian and later hunter-gatherers reworked the map. Then farming arrived. Then steppe ancestry arrived. The result is that Sungheer looks familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. Familiar because it belongs to early Europe, unfamiliar because the genetic and paternal lines have passed through so many later filters that the people themselves seem like relatives from a vanished house. Native American ancestry carries the same lesson from another direction. The ancestors of indigenous Americans were not created out of a simple, isolated Northeast Asian group alone. They formed from deep ancestral streams, including one with northern Eurasian roots. That northern stream is related to ancient Siberian genomes that also connect back, at a deeper level, toward Western Eurasian ancestry. This explains why ancient individuals like Malta sit in such an unexpected position, geographically Siberian, genetically tied in part toward Western Eurasia, and ancestrally relevant to Native Americans. Sungheer sits earlier and farther west, but it helps reveal that this northern world existed long before the American founding lineage crossed into the New World. The archaeological implications are just as important as the genetic ones. If people across northern Eurasia shared ancestry over such wide distances, then the movement of ideas, materials, and marriage partners also becomes easier to imagine. Mammoth ivory technology, bead traditions, burial symbolism, hunting strategies, and social rules were not trapped inside tiny valleys. They traveled through human networks. Sungheer shows people able to invest in long-term craft production, organize elaborate ceremonies, and maintain wide social ties. These are exactly the kinds of capacities needed for survival in the Ice Age North, where a group cut off from exchange would face serious danger. The ornaments were not only beauty, they were social technology. They marked identity, alliance, memory, and belonging across a harsh world. There is a temptation to treat the Sungheer burials as evidence of kings, chiefs, or inherited rank in a fully formed hierarchy. That is too blunt. The graves show inequality in treatment, but not a settled kingdom or rigid class system. They show that some people were marked as different in death, and perhaps in life, through enormous ceremonial investment. The children make that unmistakable. Their burial richness cannot be explained only by hunting skill or adult achievement. It points to assigned meaning, family prestige, ritual identity, or a belief that certain individuals carried a role beyond ordinary life. The physical differences seen in the children have often been discussed in that context, because visible difference can become socially meaningful in many cultures. At Sungheer, difference was not hidden. It was placed at the center of one of the richest graves in the Ice Age. This matters because the same human capacities that built Sungheer also built the larger ancestry story. The spread of people across Eurasia was not just a matter of feet moving over ground. It required rules for trust, marriage exchange, conflict avoidance, symbolic recognition, and identity across distance. A bead style, a burial custom, a body covering, a carved ivory form, or a shared ritual could signal who belonged inside a broader human network. Sungheer gives us the material version of that network. Ancient genetics gives us the biological version. Together they reveal a world in which early modern humans were already operating at a continental scale, not as faceless wanderers, but as communities with memory, structure, and symbolic language. The Western European connection, then, is not simply that Sungheer resembles Cro-Magnon Europe. It is that Sungheer proves early Europe was plural from the beginning. Western Europe had its caves, art, and burials. Eastern Europe had Sungheer, with its ivory wealth and ritual intensity. Central Europe had its own clusters and transformations. These were not identical peoples, but they were linked. Their ancestry overlapped, their worlds touched. The idea of a single neat European origin gives way to a more interesting picture. A broad Upper Paleolithic metapopulation spread across the continent, with regional branches, local traditions, and deep shared ancestry. The Native American connection is even more revealing because it breaks the mental wall between Europe and the Americas. It shows that part of the ancestry that later entered the Americas was tied to a deep northern Eurasian source, not confined neatly to the Pacific edge of Asia. The founding peoples of the Americas carried ancestry from a mixed formation, and one part of that formation looks back toward ancient Siberians with Western Eurasian affinities. That is why Sung-Hir belongs in the story, not as a direct ancestor marching toward Alaska, but as an early witness to the broader ancestry field from which those later northern lineages emerged. Sung-Hir is a Western window into a world that eventually had Eastern consequences. This is the real power of the site. Sung-Hir forces us to stop thinking in clean boxes. Europe here, Asia there, America somewhere else. The Ice Age world was not arranged that way. The mammoth steppe tied regions together. Human groups spread across ecological corridors that have since vanished. Coastlines shifted. Glaciers expanded and retreated. Beringia itself was not merely a bridge, but a homeland for long periods. A region where ancestral groups interacted before some moved into the Americas. By the time people entered the New World, they already carried a deep Eurasian inheritance shaped by contact, mixture, and distance across thousands of years. Sung-Hir also reminds us that ancestry is not identity in a simple sense. The people buried under red ochre near Moscow were not Europeans in the modern political or cultural meaning. They were not Native Americans. They were not Siberians in the later sense. They were Ice Age people belonging to a world before those categories existed. But their genetic position helps explain how later categories formed. They are part of the hidden architecture underneath them. To study Sung-Hir is to look beneath the surface of modern ancestry and see older human layers, some of which survived strongly, some faintly, and some only through fragments recovered from ancient bones. That is why the site feels so haunting. The burials already seem like messages from a vanished society, but the genetics turns them into something larger. The beads on the adult male, the ivory spears beside the children, the ochre staining the grave, the lack of simple family relationships, the connection to early European ancestry, the distant echo toward Native American formation through the broader northern Eurasian world, all of it points to a human story that is more tangled and more dramatic than the familiar version. Sung-Hir is not an isolated burial ground. It is a signal flare from a lost network. In the end, the most mysterious thing about Sung-Hir is not that the people were advanced, because the evidence makes their sophistication undeniable. The deeper mystery is how much of their world disappeared while still leaving traces inside later humanity. Their ornaments remained in the ground. Their exact traditions vanished. Their paternal lines faded into rarity. Their society left only fragments. Yet the broader ancestry field they belonged to did not vanish completely. It flowed west into the deeper ancestry of Europe. It flowed east through related northern lineages into Siberia. And through those eastern branches, part of that ancient northern Eurasian inheritance crossed into the ancestry of Native Americans. Sung-Hir is therefore not just a burial site. It is a reminder that the Ice Age was filled with human worlds that were lost, transformed, and folded into people who came much later, carrying echoes of places they had never seen and ancestors whose names were already gone before history began. Thank you for watching, and please like and subscribe if you found this video compelling.